Technology has always been at the heart of intelligence, whether that is going back thousands of years to the very first examples of invisible ink.
Is this the golden age of espionage?
We're looking at a more challenging age of spying. So if you're a spy on the ground, a human intelligence officer working for an agency like CIA or MI6 or RAW in India's case, you have to now deal with the fact that when you cross a border, your fingerprints may be taken and stored in biometric databases.
Shashank Joshi, the defense editor at The Economist. Prior to joining The Economist in 2018, served as a senior research fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, and also research associate at Oxford University's Changing Character of War program. He's published books on Iran's nuclear program and India's armed forces. Countries are realizing that they're at least a decade, if not 2 decades, late to the game because the ownership of cloud infrastructure, the ownership of the subsea cable lies in the hands of a few firms and possibly even fewer countries.
This is a fascinating domain. So 2017, China tries to build a cable that's between Australia and the Solomon Islands. By building this cable, China will be in a superior, more advantageous position either to cut the cable in wartime or to be able to tap the cable. So the Australians then said, actually, we're going to step in and provide an alternative project.
Let's also talk about the other piece, which is in the skies, right? Spy satellites. Talk to us about the geopolitics of that layer of the tech infrastructure as well.
In 1982, there's a war over the Falkland Islands. Argentina invades the British Falkland Islands, and America tries to help provide satellite images and realizes that American satellites, a lot of them are pointing in the wrong place. Now, today, if you look at Planet Labs, they are imaging, I think, every point in the world every day. Effectively, there is only one player right now, and that is SpaceX with its Starlink constellation. Of course, China is looking to build its own comparable constellation. India has launched many reconnaissance satellites. Japan has launched some. Israel has many of these of its own. And that shows you how access to space imagery like this can become a source of geopolitical leverage and strength. Many of the breakthroughs today are not in these closed government laboratories. They're in the private sector, and governments are scrambling to adapt. These companies are more and more willing to work with intelligence agencies and armed forces and the state. These firms are inside so much of the world's digital infrastructure, so they have become these incredible signals intelligence services of their own.
I've written about the Indian armed forces. Given this changing nature of warfare, how do you assess and evaluate India's strengths, gaps, opportunities for India?
I saw the beginnings of a pretty vibrant defense technology ecosystem at the private sector level. Companies building really cutting edge things, whether that's chips that go on satellites, whether that's UAVs with autonomy in them. What struck me is in Europe and America, I hear a lot of grumbles. It's difficult to work with the Pentagon. I was pleasantly surprised by the stories I heard from some companies in India saying, actually, they're pretty receptive to us. And I think that's great news.
So I'm excited to have you with us here today on the podcast. Shashank, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be on. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, as am I. So let's dive right in, Shashank. As I was mentioning to you earlier, I read with great interest your detailed piece on how tech is shaping Spycraft, amongst other pieces that, of course, you write very frequently around issues of tech and national security. I want to dive right in with the question arising from your piece, right, in The Economist now from a few months ago, where you talk about how tech is changing the tools of Spycraft, is changing the profession. Give us a quick overview of some of the arguments you've made in that piece.
Absolutely. Well, look, technology, we should say right at the outset, has always been at the heart of intelligence, whether that is going back thousands of years to the very first examples of invisible ink. How do you pass secret messages and the chemistry of these issues, whether that's the 20th century. And I think about for instance, the early advances in transistor radios were immediately picked up by the CIA and used to make small clandestine radio sets. Or the early advances in plastics, the plastics industry, were used to make miniaturized devices, other types of secret ink. So there is always this kind of intimate link between technology, which is a very broad and big thing, and spycraft, the act of collecting intelligence, analyzing intelligence, making sense of intelligence. But, given the speed, the pace, the acceleration of technological advances in our time, the
Yeah.
feeling that we are in this kind of more accelerating period, you sense that intelligence agencies around the world, the ones I'm most familiar with are those in the Western world, but clearly all of those around the world, are grappling with what this means for them. And the way I think about this is by dividing it up into a few categories, right? You have intelligence agencies using technology for their own purposes. And for me, the big difference is that in the past, spy agencies had cutting edge, world class technology. And I'm thinking here of things like the U-2 spy plane or the Corona spy satellites of the early Cold War, these incredible, marvels of engineering that only the United States and then the Soviet Union could build in this way. But those were superpower technologies, right? Those were superpower technologies. As you know very well, and as you've discussed on this show, many of the breakthroughs today are now not in these closed government laboratories. They're in the private sector, they're in the private firms, they're in the commercial world, and governments are scrambling to adapt to those. So there's two things going on here. Spy agencies suddenly have to get technology from outside and use it for themselves rather than build it simply in house and remain the only people with access to it. And that's one facet of this. The other big facet that I think is so interesting is that they are now operating in a world in which this technology is ubiquitous. And that has all kinds of implications. So if you're a spy on the ground, a human intelligence officer working for an agency like CIA or MI6 or RAW in India's case, you have to now deal with the fact that when you cross a border, your fingerprints may be taken and stored in biometric databases
Yeah.
that will prevent you from returning to that same country under a different alias, or will at least make your life much more difficult. If you are meeting an agent on the ground in Paris or in Moscow or in Karachi or wherever else, you suddenly have to contend with the fact that a thicket of surveillance cameras equipped with facial recognition may be operating all over the cityscape in ways that would have been unaffordable and impossible just 25 years ago. So those things have fundamentally changed the world that the spies have to navigate and imposes new constraints on them. But if you're trying to catch spies, if you're trying to catch other countries' intelligence operations, it gives you new opportunities, new capabilities, and in some ways empowers you to do that.
Yeah, in my own book, as I was researching this issue, and of course it's very relevant even today, and it's getting more and more relevant, I think, as you were pointing out. Some people have called this the golden age of espionage, right? Is that your view also? Is this the golden age of espionage now, given the number of devices that you can try, the number of sensors, the number of mobile phones, or is it maybe not as black and white as some people have put it as the golden age?
I think that, as in warfare, these things are double-edged swords. They can help you spy. They can also stop you from spying, right? And in the way, when I think about the military context that I also study, sensors, drones, satellites, ubiquitous sensing has made it easier to see things on the ground, but the effect has been to aid the defense, right? It's harder to attack. It's harder to move over open ground and attack a position. It is easier to stop an attack, as we see in Ukraine. And if we extend that analogy into the spy world, I think that I wouldn't necessarily call this the golden age of spying. I mean, we did hear the term the golden age of signals intelligence, the golden age of spying at the time of the Edward Snowden's disclosure of
Yeah.
the NSA's operations in 2013. But that was a world in which very few people were aware of the practice of bulk surveillance, of bulk collection of data. A majority of the internet at that time, as you know, was unencrypted. It was in plain text. So if you could capture the fiber optic cables running into the southwest of the UK, and you were hoovering up the data, you could read most of it. You could read most of the email traffic between you and I. Nowadays, that's not the case. So in some ways, that golden age of electronic espionage that was dominant in the 2000s, I think that has faded. That has become more constrained, more difficult. And the age of human intelligence operations, the ability to conduct, a human agent meeting with
Yeah.
your agent on the city street, that has become much more difficult. So I think that we're looking at a more challenging age of spying, with perhaps one exception, which is the evolution of the cyber domain and the amount of digital data that there is, the amount it gives out about us. I think that we can talk about that, but I think that's the one exception where maybe the attack surface has exponentially grown and become more available.
Yeah, yeah. No, we'll come into the cyber piece and dig deeper there because I think that's a key element, as you rightly point out. Let's talk about the tech infrastructure that you've just tried to refer to as well. Let's lay out the landscape of the kind of tech infrastructure we've now seen mushroom. I think, as you also call it, this mushrooming network of tech infrastructure that's both aiding and abetting the activities in this world. Of course, people often like to recall the internet as a set of tubes, as was popularly called, I think, almost 2 decades ago. But now I think as much more awareness has risen, there's a very clear set of elements of this tech infrastructure. Just talk to us about that. What do you see as the key elements of that tech infrastructure globally?
Well, here I must confess I'm not a great expert, and I look at this through the perspective of those who are spying or those who are waging wars over this infrastructure. But of course, what we see is the tubes are still fundamentally important, right? Undersea cables carry 95% of the world's internet traffic, and the internet is still very physically instantiated in real things. And in fact, one could argue that the physical instantiations of the internet have become more important in the last 25 years, not least because of things like the Snowden disclosures, right? Countries are more aware of the need to keep servers on their own soil for data localization. They're more conscious of the risks that come with having infrastructure on foreign soil. But what the big change, I would say, since the Snowden era is the massive importance of cloud computing infrastructure, right? So much more of everything we do and process and use as users of the internet and users of computers is on the cloud. And this is intensely geopolitical, right? If you're sitting in Europe or a mid-sized country, even India, or a middle power, I should say, right? A sort of a non-superpower, really, you don't have all that many choices of cloud infrastructure, right? Your top end infrastructure will often be built by the Americans or the Chinese, and you take your pick. I'm aware that's simplifying it, and there are, of course, exceptions.
Yeah.
But this poses difficulties for countries in Europe. For example, if you're France, um, you may not feel terribly comfortable about having your vital government cloud services, particularly those for your national security agencies, on even if they're on French soil, run by
Amazon,
um,
now Google.
Amazon.
Yeah, correct.
Right. And the reason for that, of course, is because there's the experience of the Snowden years, and under things like the Cloud Act, which are American laws designed to facilitate lawful surveillance by the American government, they have some jurisdiction over American firms, including their data centers abroad. So the internet, has changed and evolved. The cloud's more important than it has been, but the geopolitics of it, the physicality of it, that still remains incredibly important, I would say. I guess the last thing I would say is as AI becomes more important, particularly to governments who want to process large amounts of data, whether that is data about foreign adversaries, whether that's data about troop movements, whether that's data collected by their satellites over their adversary countries, that has to be processed, and it has to be exploited. And we're discovering that is, again, much more difficult to do in practice than in theory, right? You need computing power that turns out to be extremely expensive. Some of it may need to be classified, so you need to have compute that is a high side compute that is able to deal with secret or top secret data. And these are these are difficult engineering and bureaucratic challenges for governments and organizations that simply haven't had to think about them for a very long time.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, I think, I mean, and this is something that, even in my book, I highlighted a lot that as this tech infrastructure, the cloud infrastructure, the subsea cables, data centers, data, needed for processing and exploitation tomorrow. As this has gained in significance, at the same time, we've realized the people who are countries who are realizing it now are realizing that they're at least a decade, if not 2 decades, late to the game, because the concentration of power in terms of the ownership of cloud infrastructure, the running of it, the ownership of the subsea cables, the ability to repair these subsea cables, and so on and so forth, is very, very concentrated. It lies in the hands of a few firms and possibly even fewer countries, right? So let's talk about that, like, and the implications of that. What does the global landscape look like when we look at this set of infrastructure, as well as the dynamics that you described to us earlier about how tech and spycraft are intersecting? What does the global landscape look like? Of course, you mentioned the NSA and Snowden. Of course, the US, even through its big tech firms, seems to be the leading country, and Europe and India and other places like countries like that seem to be lagging in terms of having their own cloud infrastructure players, etc. But then there's of course China. But talk to us about that global landscape. Which countries do you see as having what strengths, and which countries maybe as having certain weaknesses here or gaps?
Well, it depends which dimension of this we look at. And you raised the issue of cable. So let's maybe start with the issue of cables, right? This is a fascinating domain, which is becoming very, very geopolitical. So there are broadly three big companies that dominate the cable laying market, right? The market to lay undersea cables. You have Japan, the NEC Corporation. You have America's Subcom, and you have France, the Alcatel Submarine Networks. And those three companies are very dominant. So in that sense, the West, if you will, by which I mean America and its allies and its partners, which, in various ways, those are still dominant players. However, what you are seeing, if you look more closely at Asia, is that as in so many other areas, whether that's telecommunications or cloud computing, China, thanks to sustained and focused state investment, has risen up very dramatically. And HMN, which of course I think was originally had was a Huawei linked firm, right, and changed its name to HMN.
Huawei Marine Networks, correct? Now
Huawei Marine Networks. It's still small compared to those three, but it has been laying considerably more cables in the Asia Pacific region, right? And that has prompted a kind of, in fact, I think if I'm just looking up this figure now, it's laid about 94,000 kilometers of cables across the region, which is an incredible amount. And if you look at the time roughly between 2010 and 2023, there were about 140 cables laid in Asia and about 77 in Europe. So Asia became much more important to this. And what you're seeing is a sustained American effort to try and block out those Chinese firms. And some of that is in concert with Australia. So 2017, China tries to build a cable that's between Australia and the Solomon Islands. And the concern is that by building this cable, China will be in a superior, more advantageous position either to cut the cable in wartime or to be able to tap the cable, whether to collect data or to conduct traffic analysis. Even if it can't read the data on the cable, it could still work out who is communicating when, what the patterns of communication are, and it could glean valuable intelligence. So the Australians then said, actually, we're going to step in and provide an alternative project. And I think it was Nokia that provided the alternative project. And you're seeing this again and again in the Pacific, in Palau, East Micronesia, all across the South Pacific. The Americans, the Australians, and others are racing to counter Chinese cable laying projects. But it's not just cable laying, it's also cable repair ships. And again, this is a pretty small fleet of ships in the world. China still has considerable influence over it. And this is because fundamentally states have not invested in these very unsexy technologies, and they find themselves now in positions of considerable dependence.
Yeah. Another layer that I want to talk about, I think the subsea cables, again, to me is also fascinating. There's all this history that I think even when I was doing the research for my own book, I came across, right? The pre-World War One era, where the telegraph cables at the time, much like the subsea cables today, became very, very much a tool of geopolitical action and military action right before World War One. And so it's not a surprise if you've read that history that a similar thing is playing out with subsea cables today.
No.
Let's talk
There's
about.
a good book, by the way, by Robert Hannigan, who's a former director of GCHQ, which is the UK Signals Intelligence Service, and it's called Counterintelligence, and the book is really about the importance of lateral thinking, neurodiversity in intelligence, the intelligence world, and what spies can teach the rest of the world about different ways of thinking. But some of the early chapters are very good on the importance of cables to that pre-First World War world, and the kind of individuals who built those cable networks and exploited them in places like the Persian Gulf, where those were key nodes for the British Empire at the time. So if anyone's interested in the issue, I recommend that book.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I think that story is fascinating. Those pre-World War One stories about the telegraph cables. Let's talk about another piece, right? So this is underwater, undersea, where 95% of the traffic today of the internet is moving around, and hence it's so critical. But let's also talk about the other piece, which is in the skies, right? So
Yeah.
when we talk about now geospatial intelligence, satellite, spy satellites. Talk to us about the geopolitics of that layer of the tech infrastructure as well, and how different countries are faring on that.
Well, this has been a real revolution, right? So let me give you two examples of this. In 1982, there's a war over the Falkland Islands. Argentina invades the British Falkland Islands, and America tries to help provide satellite images. And what it realizes, I think Bob Gates is the director of the CIA at the time, and he looks at this and he realizes the American satellites, a lot of them are pointing in the wrong place. America's satellite network by the 80s is remarkable, it's robust, it's world leading, very secret, but it doesn't really have enough coverage of the South Atlantic. Now, today, you would have no trouble getting unclassified commercial satellite images of this place. If you look at Planet Labs, one of these companies, they are imaging, I think, every point in the world every day. They're imaging every point on the Earth's landmass, so not the seas, but the landmass, every day. So the scope of coverage is astonishing. But it isn't just that, right? If you look at the late 1990s, America had synthetic aperture radar satellites, SAR satellites. These are satellites that don't rely on ambient visible light from the sun or other light sources. They rely on sending active radar pulses down to the Earth and looking at the reflections by creating a kind of artificial antenna as they move through the space. And that's why it's called a synthetic aperture rather than a real aperture. Now, that technology existed in the 90s. It existed back in the 50s, but it was so heavily classified, America's government did not even acknowledge the existence of those satellites. Now, today, you and I can buy a synthetic aperture radar image of pretty much any spot that we want from a commercial company at affordable prices that wouldn't require us to mortgage our house. So this is a game-changing development, and it means that a country like Ukraine that has no fundamental space-based capability of its own is able to have near American levels of geospatial intelligence. So that revolution represents a democratization of space capability for militaries, for intelligence agencies. It also means that not just states can get this data, they can also declassify it. They can also share it because it is not as sensitive as it used to be. And so, for example, in the run up to the war in Ukraine, we saw Western governments freely share images of Russian tanks on Ukraine's border. And none of that would have been possible. None of that would have been possible without that democratization of space based capability and intelligence, which in turn is rooted, as you know very well, in plummeting launch costs, enabled above all by SpaceX, Elon Musk, SpaceX, and the ability to bring massive amounts of cargo to space at ever lower prices.
And so if you look at that last piece that you mentioned, right, that a lot of that cost reduction has been thanks to SpaceX, right? NASA choosing to sort of give that freedom to SpaceX in some ways, right? Over the last several years to innovate, and then they've managed to bring that cost down. But the other implication of that, and this is where I want to push back on the democratization
Yeah.
characterization you're making. If you look, much like in the subsea cables piece, right? If you were to look at the landscape of who's running these satellites that are enabling this imagery to be widely available or more freely available, there's again, I think, quite a big, I would say, leaning towards again one or two countries, right, and a few firms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk to
Yeah.
us about that. If you're familiar with that, of course, I think all these low
Yeah.
orbit satellites, the majority of them, several thousand, I think, are owned by Musk and his firm. And if you look at the other countries in the world, very few actually own that much.
So you're absolutely right. And it depends whether we mean proliferated constellations of thousands of communication satellites in low Earth orbit, where effectively there is only one player right now, and that is SpaceX with its Starlink constellation. Of course, China is looking to build its own comparable constellation. We know Taiwan is interested in issues like this because of the potential vulnerability of the island and its cables being cut in a conflict. But you're right. It's not as if France or India or Britain have equivalent constellations of their own, although in different ways, many of them have ambitions for this. Um, I think the situation's a bit different in reconnaissance satellites, where we are seeing increasing capabilities in the hands of people beyond the superpowers, right? So India has launched many reconnaissance satellites. Japan has launched some. Israel has many of these of its own. Now, are these on the same scale as organizations and firms like Planet? Or the new SAR providers like Umbra, ICEYE, and its ilk? No, they're not. So it's still a concentrated field. However, I think we're seeing some signs of change. And let me give you an example of that. About 18 months ago, we saw a Chinese satellite company sanctioned by America for providing satellite images to the Wagner Group, that is the Russian mercenary group in Ukraine, for providing battlefield satellite images. And that shows you how access to space imagery like this can become a source of geopolitical leverage and strength, and you can project influence with it. So are we at the point where, if a war broke out in some part of the world, that Germany or kind of Australia could themselves play the role that SpaceX has done in Ukraine? No, we are not in that world yet. But could we get there in 10 years, given the direction of space launch and these technologies? Maybe, and I'm more open-minded about that.
And how's the China, Russia, Iran, and countries on that side of the spectrum? How are they faring on this front?
Well, I would say two things here. Well, China is faring very well because it has the heft of the state behind it. And, it's been launching satellite after satellite after satellite. I haven't got the exact figures to hand, but in the last 10 years, it's launched a gargantuan amount of satellites. If you're interested, the latest Pentagon's the annual China military power report is a very good summary of the issue. And if you look at some of their latest launches of satellites to cover the Pacific region, I was talking to experts about this 6 months ago, and they were basically telling me that the PLA now has the ability to monitor large swaths of the Pacific with pretty much blanket coverage. That is, there are no gaps in coverage between passes of satellites. There's enough density of coverage. You can have continuous sight of what's happening. And that gives you enormous ability to then begin to try to find, for instance, US aircraft carriers and then feed that data to missile systems in the region. So China's doing very well. Russia is in a very different place. Russia's satellite reconnaissance has struggled. It has struggled even in Ukraine. It has very obsolete satellites. It's struggled to replace them. It's struggled to update them. And I think we see clear signs of difficulty. But here's the thing. What we learn is that your commercial ecosystem is so important, right? Your commercial ecosystem is vital. And Russia just doesn't have the same dynamism and vibrancy of the Americans. So it's going to struggle. But the other thing I would add to this is it's not just about having the satellites. You can have all these images coming down. What are you doing with the images? So you need the software stack to be able to process these things, both on the edge, increasingly on the satellite, which means you don't need to send down terabytes of images. You just send down the thing that you are looking for and that your chip on the satellite can find. And we increasingly see that, for example, in the latest Planet satellites, but I can give you examples from many other companies as well, doing onboard processing of the imagery or doing processing at home in the rear on the cloud back home, saying, okay, we've got thousands upon thousands of images of, let's say, the South China Sea. I can't process this, but I need cutting edge AI to be able to tell me, let's match this to the known data on the transponders of ships that we know from ship tracking data, track it to the pictures of the ships from space. Where do we see anomalies? Where do we see mismatch? Where do we see gaps? The countries that have the advanced software capabilities that can take advantage of the surveillance assets, those are the ones that will have the edge. And right now, again, I think clearly the Americans are well ahead of anyone else.
Yeah, yeah. Another guest I had, Shank, some time ago, Abe Newman, and Henry Farrell wrote this book, right? I think you might be familiar with it, called The Underground Empire. And I think as we were talking, to me, the new title coming to my mind was the empire that's no longer underground. It's really in the skies now, because once you have those images and you have that software ability to process it and create intelligence out of it, I think you are looking at a key significant advantage in any conflict, right? Cold or hot,
Yes.
for the country
Yes.
to possess.
I think that's right. Although, of course, I would say that because of the importance of these overhead assets,
Yeah.
they will also be targets for destruction in wartime. And we haven't seen that in Ukraine because the conflict, in many ways, has been isolated to Ukraine. Russia has not had the risk appetite to start taking out American satellites or European satellites for obvious reasons, that this would be highly escalatory, even though in some cases they probably are providing battlefield intelligence to Ukraine. Now, in a conflict involving China and America, would we see the same kind of restraint towards space assets? Perhaps not. And I think we always need to bear this in mind, that commercial companies may not be safe and protected as they appear to be in this conflict in future conflicts.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the piece I want to dig into now. So, this idea of big tech firms versus the state. Right now, Shashank, when my book comes out about 3 years ago, I wrote a chapter in my book called "The Tug of War:
Yeah.
Big Tech Firms versus the State." Now, if I was to write that chapter, I might not call it the tug of war anymore. I might say the collusion of big tech versus the state. And that point, I remember warning in a way that there's three pieces of this triangle as I was seeing at that time. There were big tech firms, there were governments, and then there was the citizens of the society, right?
Yes.
At that point, I remember talking about this with various people, that if any of these two of the three nodes come together, it'll really create an uneven field for the third, right? But as long as they stay sort of opposed to each other and counteracting each other, you have a balance that's maintained, right, in that triangle. Now, in the last couple of years, I think, as you would have also noticed, we are finding that as geopolitical conflict has gotten heated up, as wars have broken out, the stakes have gone up. The tech firms, and I think this is going to clearly, as the last few days have shown, only exacerbate more under the new US administration as well. The big tech firms and governments, much like the US has accused the Chinese of, now in the US also, you're seeing that same nexus emerge, where the resistance of big tech firms and the employees within these big tech firms to work on defense projects, right? You have many various examples around Project Maven and Google employees and so on and so forth protesting. That resistance seems to be going away, and there's this nexus now emerging. Is that how you're seeing it as well?
I completely agree, but it depends whether we are looking within countries or between countries, right? Between countries, we see that the sort of, as this sort of sovereignty becomes more of a focus, as the companies become more geographically rooted, conscious of their jurisdictions, the battles between countries become more intense. And I'm thinking here of TikTok versus America, but I'm also thinking here of Elon Musk versus Europe. And you no doubt know many cases we've also seen in the Asian context as well. But what you're describing, and I agree wholeheartedly, is a sense that for many big tech companies, they are much more comfortable with the national security and defense applications of their technologies. And you cited Project Maven, and Maven was just, for everyone understands, an AI object recognition initiative, an AI initiative in the DoD that has now become a program of record. I think it's part of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. But there are so many other examples, right? OpenAI initially said that its technology, including ChatGPT and GPT-4 and others, should not be used for military or intelligence purposes. In 2023, I think at the beginning of 2023, they dropped that proviso.
Yeah.
And they changed that. They embraced these applications. And there's been a recent study by Plus 972, which is an Israeli publication that does very good investigative work, pointing out the immense role played by Microsoft Azure for cloud services and OpenAI in working with the Israel Defense Forces and the Israel Defense Ministry, including for things like building surveillance platforms in Gaza and other places. Now, that has obviously provoked concern, and you see protests within Google on their own firm's work with the IDF and with Israel. But it is not on the same scale or significance as the Maven protests of 2018. The leadership of Google has been able to say, they've been able to ride it out. They've been able to say, we hear you, but we're going to do this anyway. And I think that shows you how, certainly for the biggest beasts, Microsoft, OpenAI, for Google, for many of these other companies, and then you have, of course, the dedicated defense and technology defense specialists, Palantir, Anduril, others, Helsing in Europe. They see no contradiction between the kind of ethos of the technology industry and the importance of national security defense. Now, look, would that change in a conflict if these companies were coming at direct risk? Let's say if there was a war over Taiwan and America was not directly involved, would these companies provide the same assistance to Taiwan that they have provided to Ukraine? Actually, they may see it as unduly risky. Whereas if America was directly involved, of course, I think we would see a kind of patriotic, nationalistic pulling together of efforts. So the trend is exactly as you describe it, but perhaps with some of those nuances.
What caused this shift, according to you?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I suspect the outbreak of the war in Ukraine has been a huge part of it, because certainly from a European perspective, from an American perspective, this is a relatively straightforward war where we have kind of moral and political clarity from our perspective, and certainly the perspective of our citizens and our companies, which is have a large country conducting conventional aggression against another smaller country to basically wipe it out and annex it, and change borders in Europe by force for the first time since 1945. And that is such a clear-cut case from the sort of way the popular view here, that companies see that, this is not drone strikes in Waziristan, where the fear was you're killing the wrong people, or you're kind of doing a distant conflict where you're making mistakes, you're hitting wedding parties. This feels like a just war, a clearly just campaign, and it feels like one in which democracy in the West, the cohesion of our alliances, is directly at stake. And so it is a much easier call to say, look, Ukrainians are defending their lives, we have to help them.
But that's government speak, right? I mean, that's
not the case in the Middle East, right? That's not the case in the Middle East, where it's much more complexity and ambiguity around these conflicts, and therefore much greater hesitation.
How much of it has to do with the great power competition frame that has now been applied to U.S. national security thinking?
Yeah.
The U.S. versus China. So Ukraine, of course, I see your point that maybe that's a case study, but how much of the shift in thinking would you attribute to this realization that in the U.S. national security establishment that we have now moved away from counterterrorism as the frame to great power competition, and hence now we need a whole of country, whole of government effort?
I think that's also part of it, right? You had a moment, as you know, what was it, maybe 10 years ago, maybe more recently than that, in which these companies were still flirting with their businesses in China. Right, you had the great Google debates, which then they then made a big choice. But Microsoft AI had a huge presence in China. Microsoft itself was very heavily involved, and this was seen as, we have to do this. That changed for a number of reasons. One of them was the direction of China and its deeply authoritarian turn under Xi Jinping and the consolidation and centralization of power in his person. So China changed. But you're absolutely right. I agree completely. That acceleration of US-China competition, along with the sense that, look, the Americans were saying, look at China. They have military civil fusion. They are relying upon all of the resources of the state and society in the private sector to further their national ambitions. They are using Tencent and ByteDance and Huawei and Baidu and all of these other companies and forcing them to work with the state. And here we have a situation in the US where you are at odds with us as the state. Now, these things are always going to be different in a democracy, right? They're always going to be different in a democracy. You will always have some firms like IBM that have worked with the state since the earliest days, and you will have others that are a little bit more hesitant about this. But nonetheless, that sense of we are in strategic competition with a country that is corralling all of its own firms into collaboration with the state, and this competition could decide basically who is dominant in the 21st century. I think that particularly in the realm of AI, in the last perhaps 3 or 4 years since the ChatGPT moment, I think that has concentrated minds and lubricated some of this cooperation. However, there are still, I think, there would still be some hesitation around the engineers building these things that hasn't entirely gone away.
Are there any firms left with that kind of strong resistance that they would say no? Are there any big tech firms
Absolutely. Well, look at. I'm talking to you here from the UK, and in London we have one of the world's greatest AI companies, DeepMind.
owned by
Now,
Google?
DeepMind is part of Google, right? But when it joined Google, and this is in its mission statement and its ethos and its rules, it doesn't work on military technology. It doesn't want its AI to be used for military purposes. This obviously creates some issues when Google DeepMind has been integrated into Google more deeply in the last several years. And so, if you're designing algorithms that are fantastic and fantastically capable of object recognition, it's becoming more difficult to say that that will never find its way into military applications. But at DeepMind, that commitment still exists. And I suspect there are still some other people who are quite uncomfortable about this, but that reluctance is fading. It's eroding exactly as you say. And these companies are more and more willing to work with intelligence agencies and armed forces and the state.
How much of it would you attribute it to um, this shift again and this overcoming of this resistance that was there a few years ago to the antitrust efforts of the state?
Um,
They've been under the antitrust umbrella, over the attack antitrust efforts over the last few years. Of course, Europe has had its own efforts against these big tech firms and lots of fines coming in. The US, the FTC, has been looking very deeply into whether these companies need to be broken up. Um,
the argument
you
here
put
is
two and
that
two
because
together, you see that there could be a connect here as well. What's your
you
sense?
mean in the sense that they face intense regulatory pressure from the state, and in a bid to mitigate that pressure, they feel they are moving closer to the state and more in a more working more favorably with it. Is that the argument? I think that you it's too early to say. I think that in most cases the other factors we've been discussing have been predominant. However, when I look at the last few days, as we have this conversation at the end of January, 4 days after the inauguration of Donald Trump, it's been really striking to see
Yeah,
people like Sam Altman and
you
Mark
saw his tweet.
Zuckerberg
You saw his tweet, Shashank. Yeah.
make quite obsequious statements towards the incoming administration, right? Quite one might uncharitably call it groveling, and I suspect there is a fear of that pressure as well, that may be pushing them in that direction. I'm not sure how much that applies on the defense national security side, but it certainly kind of makes them want to play nice with the incoming administration, which fundamentally they fear. I will say, however, look at the EU. The EU is also putting immense pressure on these companies, but actually the response has been for these companies to turn towards Washington and say, protect us from the Europeans. Keep us from these crazy Europeans, because they're trying to regulate us and attack us. So there is there may be a further breakdown of the relationship between the tech companies and Europeans. And so what does that mean if you're a European company, a European defense establishment or European army or intelligence service that wants to work with Google or with Microsoft? How does that relationship then play out? So there's all kinds of strange international complexities to this as well.
Yeah, of course, Europe has even more dependence, right? Whether through NATO or through the US, in a battlefield like Ukraine or tomorrow another battlefield, as much, if not more, dependence on Starlink and SpaceX and others of the kind of companies we're talking about than even the US. The US at least has something to hold over these firms. The Europeans don't, right? Let me ask you another question related to these firms, right? So when I was writing, again, I'll refer back to my book, one of the chapters is on digital colonialism. Now, at least in a country like India and many other countries that have gone through a few hundred years of colonial history, there is this sense amongst politicians, amongst leaders, amongst the general public, that you want to avoid another era of colonialism or anything that looks like it. And there has been talk, maybe not as much in the mainstream in the US and elsewhere, but at least talk in some of the developing world and in the global south, in countries that have had that colonial history, that we do not want to become victims of yet another phase of digital colonialism. So when I was looking at that question in my book, and I'd spoken to a few people academics who've studied the past era of colonialism with the East India companies and other colonial enterprises and today's big tech firms, to see if there are actually substantive parallels. One of the things that comes up as a key difference at the time, a few years ago at least, was that the East India companies of the world in history come as traders, but then very quickly have a military arm as well, right? And the argument that a lot of people against digital colonialism make is that these big tech firms today, they might come to countries around the world as markets, for looking for markets and consumers, but they don't have armies. But as our conversation also very clearly shows, and I think anyone following Ukraine sees it, you've spoken about it, you've written about it, everyone knows that today the cyber armies of the Microsofts of the world, the defense tech firms that are focused specifically on this, the Palantirs of the world, there's clearly a whole set of big tech firms with armies practically now, cyber armies there. And in a way, we've entered what I think one of the professors of LSE that I spoke to about this mentioned. This is the second phase where, to protect your commercial interests, you also need to start developing some amount of military. Is there a sense that we are going deeper into a world where digital cyber armies of big tech firms become as consequential as maybe the military arms of an East India company back in the day?
I don't think, and I certainly hope we're not in a comparable position.
I think we all hope. We all hope.
But I think the fundamental point here is about dependence and leverage and how that can constrain your choices as a sovereign state, right? And here, the difference in attitude between where you sit and where I sit is really fascinating and important. Where I am, we're very comfortable with the idea of dependence because we have been in an alliance, a deep alliance with the United States since 1945. In fact, before that point. And we have accepted a situation where we rely on a common pool of nuclear missiles with the Americans. We build our submarines with the Americans. We have our intelligence apparatus integrated with the Americans.
And you're seeing Europe, now, you're seeing the UK?
The UK, correct, absolutely, the UK. But I could broaden it out and say in Europe, we are in a military alliance with the Americans in which we depend on them for pretty much lots of fundamental capabilities. We cannot defend Europe without the Americans. Now, is this ideal? No. Does this constrain our choices? Yes. Are we more aware of this since the election of more unpredictable presidents like Donald Trump? Absolutely. However, we can. It doesn't kind of cut. It doesn't touch a historical nerve with us in the same way it would if you're sitting in India, where, of course, you are much less comfortable for obvious reasons with that idea of dependence. A country with not just a history of colonialism, but a history of non-alignment, or more recently of kind of multi-alignment, where the importance of avoiding that dependence is much more at the forefront of your minds, and you're willing to pay a bigger cost for it, right? You're willing to pay to sort of, you wouldn't depend on the Americans for certain things in quite the same way, whereas we would be very comfortable with that. So the debate therefore plays out differently. I will say that, however, the other big question is you pick your poison in this field, right? And so it's all well and good to say, yes, we'd like sovereign capabilities in all of these strategic technologies, from social media to AI to defense to satellites to cables. It's not going to happen. The investments are too great. The R&D burden is too high. We will have to share these things with trustworthy allies,
Yeah, so
right?
it's the US versus China, and clearly the US would be the choice for NATO. And
well, right, and we see this with the cloud infrastructure. Do we as Europeans? The UK is in a slightly different position given the Five Eyes intelligence alliance. But if you're France or Germany or other countries, do you like the fact that Americans are building your cloud systems? You may be a little bit uncomfortable with it, but are you going to prefer that to a Chinese company? 100%. 100%. But are you going to pay 5 to 10 to 15 billion euros to build out your alternative national champions with all of the infrastructure? Maybe not. Whereas if you are India, or if you are a country with that history, maybe you make different choices. So we will be informed by those different historical experiences.
Yeah. So let's dig deeper. Now, is your sense that these private firms, the other question that comes to mind, right? We've discussed that they are coming closer together with the government. You mentioned that in certain conflicts, like let's say Ukraine, they found alignment with the governments and its own geopolitical goals, the US governments. In Taiwan, that might not be the case tomorrow. In another part of the world, another conflict breaks out, it might not. Is your sense that these private firms will at least remain limited to working with trustworthy friends of the US? You mentioned, I think, in your piece in The Economist that, for example, Recorded Future, and we can dig deeper into the cyber piece also now as we start talking about this, has 47 governments as their clients, right? If I recall the number correctly from your piece. That's a large number of governments to be working with. So the question is, are there any governments that these firms start serving that are actually not aligned or partnered or friendly with the host country, in this case, the US? Is that possible?
Again, that's a great question. It is absolutely possible. I think in most cases, these companies, partly because of the sort of ideological element in this, the sense of national mission, they don't want to be seen to be working for adversaries. It isn't good for them, right? It is not good for them. You don't want to be seen to be working either with outright enemies like Russia, adversaries like China, or with states where you have very dubious governments that have committed grave human rights abuses like Myanmar. However, there are gray areas. Right? How would you classify Saudi Arabia, a country that is obviously an authoritarian monarchy that is repressive, but it's an ally of the United States? There's no question about it, right? And so that dilemma will arise. It will arise frequently. I see it in cases of spyware companies doing intrusive spyware. The most famous example being NSO Group, the Israeli company, which is clearly had its product used by some very unsavory actors for some very unsavory purposes. There are American firms, including those with ex-NSA operatives, who have also been involved in some questionable activities. There are Indian firms we've seen which have done spyware on behalf of clients that have some very clearly unsavory tasks. So you're absolutely right, I think, to look at this line of inquiry, which is to say that no, when you have the private sector capable of doing some quite serious intelligence activity, it's not always going to fall neatly onto pure allies and friends. It's going to sometimes be much more complicated and controversial than that.
Yeah. Recorded Future, which you talk a fair bit about, right? In your piece in The Economist, is an interesting case. Let's talk about them for a second, because it seems in the world of cyber warfare, cyber attacks, cyber espionage. In addition to the SIGINT agencies of various countries, like the NSAs and the GCHQs of the world, firms like Recorded Future today, it seems, have a lot of intelligence that they have gathered, a lot of ability to monitor. They are the ones who, I think, issue a lot more reports, them, Mandiant, others, about attacks, right? Governments are usually more reticent. So talk to us about the role you feel like these firms, the cybersecurity firms, firms monitoring cyber activity, cyber attacks, Palo Alto Networks, there's a whole range of them. What role do you see them playing in future cyber conflicts?
Well, they
And
have
what are they
been.
already playing? What kind of roles are they already playing? And how do you expect their role to evolve?
Well, you have to remember, right? Signals intelligence agencies can collect a lot of data about cyber activity on the internet, on servers, but on the whole, domestically, they don't have the authorities to go sit inside, your computers, unless you've specifically done something wrong, which I presume you haven't. They're not running telemetry off your router at home. Whereas if you're a business and you have cybersecurity services by Microsoft or Google, you have their network monitoring software sitting inside your systems. That is to say, in host, as the phrase goes. So they collect. Think about the spread of Microsoft infrastructure around the world. Think about how important Google is. Think about the role of firms like CrowdStrike, Mandiant, ESET in Slovakia, so many others we could name, Kaspersky in Russia. These firms are inside so much of the world's digital infrastructure. They sometimes see more activity, more traffic, more signals than the world signals intelligence agencies do. They have different strengths, of course. They can't hack into an adversary actively. They're not allowed to do that, but they can sit passively and collect. So they have become these incredible signals intelligence services of their own. And the evidence of this is, look at Ukraine. Um, the private sector companies helped Ukraine's cyber defense in February of 2022 and effectively blunted what was an intense cyber assault by the Russians. Another example would be I think Mandiant that if I'm not mistaken here, I may be getting my firms muddled, that publicly revealed the Vault Typhoon intrusions, which were the Chinese intrusions into the American critical national infrastructure systems. It was not American agencies that divulged those. Now, maybe they knew about those and kept them secret, but it was a private sector company that published and revealed those and put them into the public domain. That could never have happened. Can you imagine a private firm revealing an act of espionage or sabotage 30 years ago and being the one that reveals it to the public? I think that shows you the power and the capability they now have, and therefore that gives them a great influence and leverage as well.
And there as well, are we seeing, much like we were talking about the case of satellites and recon satellites and subsea cables, are we again living in a world where even on this front, on cybersecurity, cyber intelligence, both in-host and otherwise, are we seeing again a big concentration of firms primarily in the US and the rest of the world being dependent on them?
You are still seeing the pattern of the most influential, powerful, capable firms are in the United States. Now, I have mentioned some other examples, Kaspersky in Russia, but that's interesting because Kaspersky effectively has been thrown out of the US market because of suspicions that it's too close to Russian intelligence. Likewise, in Europe, we see ESET, which is, I think, a Slovakian company. They've been very prominent, very, very, very influential. I could give you UK examples, Darktrace and others. And I'm sure there are other national sovereign examples that we see in Asia. But if we're talking about who is most influential globally, absolutely, it's still back down to this cluster of American companies. And here, by the way, there are network effects. So if you have your software, your telemetry inside systems around the world, you are more likely to spot and track and learn the signatures, the telltale signatures of a Russian or Chinese hacking group. And that will feed back into your ability to catch future attempts by these same groups in other parts of the world, because they might reuse parts of their code, they might reuse parts of the servers or tools that they use to conduct their attacks. And so the bigger you get, the more influential you get, the more of this snowball effect that it has on your business. So once again, this gives an advantage to those American companies.
And that's why I think the Microsofts and the Googles of the world are going around acquiring a lot of these firms as well,
Yes.
which makes sense. In all of this, you've written about the end-to-end encryption piece. There was a big battle between these firms and governments over end-to-end encryption. Even in India, in Europe, in the US, a lot of the firms came out and said, no, 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 we're not, especially like WhatsApp, let's say, and others said, we will never break that end-to-end encryption promise that we've given to our customers. We will not create backdoors, even if for national security purposes. Where does all of that stand? Is your sense that debate, because that debate seems to have gone away from the mainstream discourse, what's happened to that debate?
Well, it's still very live within countries, but I think effectively, this was called the crypto wars of the 90s and the crypto wars of the 2000s, where government said, end-to-end encryption is dangerous. We must have lawful access to this, and we saw it all around the world. That the crypto wars have really been won by encryption. I think that's just undoubtedly the case, right? You and I can message via an end-to-end encrypted app that would have been the envy of a intelligence officer in the 1970s because of the capability on our personal devices, whether that's Signal, WhatsApp, or other things. And governments effectively have had to accept it. They haven't been able to fight it. What's more, when I looked at the case of we recently had an example called the Salt Typhoon attacks. As you probably know, this was a major Chinese espionage campaign against American telecommunication networks, in which they were able to monitor texts, phone calls, and other activity, including that of very senior American officials, but also of millions of Americans. And in response, the FBI and the other agencies said to American officials and others, use end-to-end encryption to keep you safe. That's a remarkable thing to hear, because in the 1990s, the FBI was saying end-to-end encryption is only for terrorists and pedophiles, and you should not be using it. And so that shows you the cultural, intellectual change that has taken place over the years. Encryption has won. It can't be put back in the box. And although there are many proposals for lawful access, things like key escrow systems or other proposals, none of these have really taken hold since they've been proposed and aired. None of them have really found viable ways to be implemented without compromising the integrity and security of communication systems for consumers and officials.
Yeah. Let's shift towards the future of war from a different standpoint. Now, we've spoken a lot about various kinds of big tech firms and cybersecurity firms. One set of firms we've not spoken about that have in detail, we've touched upon them, are the new age defense tech firms, right? I think the world knows about the US military industrial complex, the large firms that exist in the US that power that defense industrial complex. And there seems to be in recent, I would say, months and years, a shift happening there. Right, I come from the world of venture capital, as I was telling you, and there's this sense that the incumbents that have been in that military-industrial complex of the U.S. are now seeing a whole new set of challenges in the form of Palantir and Anduril and, of course, SpaceX and others. Shashank, from your perspective, you study the changing nature of war, right? Are you seeing that these new-age defense tech firms are overhyped for the role they're actually playing? Or are they, you think, at the cusp of actually challenging the primacy of the existing incumbent military-industrial complex?
I think that the emerging consensus is that armies will need what we call a high-low mix. That is to say, armies are not going to be composed of small, smart, software-based systems like drones, and that's it. You will still have exquisite ballistic missiles that cannot be built by a small company in its backyard. You will still have aircraft carriers. You will still have warships that need steel, industrial strength, integration. They will take years to build. However, you will, at the low end, also have what is called attritable mass or precise mass. That is, instead of having hundreds of warships or thousands of warships, you may need to have hundreds or thousands of smaller, cheaper, disposable, autonomous systems that can be lost because loss rates will be very high thanks to jamming, thanks to attacks, thanks to attrition. And so, to come back to your question, what that means is the companies that are best at building software first systems, are they going to be the ones that built you a big hull and a sonar system and a radar over 5 years? Or are they going to be the ones who know how software is built today, which is iteratively, quickly, rapidly, experimentally? So it's going to be the innovative companies who know how to do that, right? It's not going to be the ones who've tacked on AI as the separate bit of their mission, thinking, oh, we're good at building massive warplanes, but we'll just tack a little bit of AI on top of that. That's just not how it works, right? It's like imagining a conglomerate trying to pivot towards AI. It's just not easy. So what does that mean for these companies? It means I think you will still have the primes in the US context, the big primes, your Lockheeds, your Boeings, your kind of BAEs in Europe, but you will also have this big flourishing ecosystem of companies that are more nimble and new and adaptive and capable of working at that low end. Now, I can't tell you whether any individual one of these companies is overhyped, because that's the nature of creative destruction, is that companies come along, they build things, some of them work, some of them don't, and you don't quite know until they're tested and pitted in practice. In fact, I believe that in Ukraine, we're going to see a generation of some of the most incredible defense companies come out of this conflict that whose names we don't even know at present, that are building some remarkable things.
Like which ones?
Oh well, I mean, I've just been. I've just been writing a piece on electronic warfare recently, and I was talking to a company in Ukraine called Kratos, which does electronic warfare systems. And a lot of companies build EW systems to jam and to sort of spoof, but these guys, like many other Ukrainian firms, are building them in the battle zone. So they're not testing them in a lab; they're testing them on the front lines, and that gets fed back directly into the product. And I could give you other examples of people building. Whose names elude me now, but who are building, target recognition systems for drones with small $50 chips that can go inside any drone. So it's hardware agnostic. So I can't tell you whether one company will survive, but I am pretty confident that we will see a generation of companies rise up at that low and medium end, at least, some of whom will begin nipping at the heels of the primes, building the products right now that don't really exist. So, for example, if you look at the Replicator Initiative, this is the US DoD initiative to build thousands of low-cost, attritable drones for the Pacific, the war in the Pacific. Look at the companies involved in that. It is mostly defense technology companies, some of them very small, some of them medium-sized, but it's not the primes. And I am very confident that some of those will be the big, successful companies in 10 or 15 years' time.
Future. And are you also seeing this, you've seen the emergence of players like Turkey, countries like Turkey, in that drone context, right? Are you seeing that there could also be the opportunity for new countries to become more significant defense manufacturers, given this low piece that you're talking about?
Absolutely, right. I gave you the example of Ukraine, and when I look at some company, I wrote about a company called Helsing, which does AI defense and is now building its own drones. But in Ukraine, it has realized the value added is in the software that can allow the drone to fly, stabilize in flight, recognize the target, all of these other things. So it's as I said, hardware agnostic, and it's building out the drone hardware, the airframes, in Ukrainian factories at scale. And not on a kind of beautiful production timeline, a scale where everything is identical. Different drones with different speeds, different wings, different levels of strength, different levels of weight. But the software adapts. The software thinks, okay, here's how I calibrate to the hardware and I adapt the flight. So that's a great example of hardware manufacturers in Ukraine rising up to become these producers, integrating with software developers to produce this very successful product. Now, you gave the example of Turkey. I could also say South Korea. I think the answer is it is the software that is going to be critical, right? The hardware is not going to be the critical thing. So you can occupy different parts of the supply chain. Right now, everyone is terrified because China clearly dominates the UAV supply chain. Everyone is realizing this is a source of great dependence, but we don't have other great supply chains for motors, for sensors, for radio antennae, for all these other things. So some countries will become highly successful at developing bits of those supply chains. Other countries will say, actually, I don't care where the thing's built. If it's built in, Ukraine or in Taiwan or somewhere else, but why build it in Germany where costs are much higher? As long as we are building the software for it and we are cornering that element of the stack.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it seems like you're a true believer of the phrase you're starting to hear a lot coming out of Silicon Valley also now, that the future of war is software.
The future is software, but I have to say, bearing in mind that high-low mix, there's still someone still has to build your Storm Shadow or your BrahMos missiles. Someone still has to build your Prithvi ballistic missiles or your kind of F-35. Those things are not going away. I'm not a sort of Muskian who looks at a pretty drone swarm in China and says, why are we building F-35? I believe that we must understand the different roles these systems play. So I know that a F-35 does completely different things that at present a low-cost UAV cannot do because of its range, its payload, its power, its sensing. It's not going to happen. So let's not, we can't sort of have such a radical vision that we assume everything is just nanobots taking over all the systems.
We've got a lot of ground, Shashank. I know we have little time left, but you've written about the Indian Armed Forces. You cover the world in the work you do at The Economist. Let's spend a couple of minutes talking about your assessment of, given this changing nature of warfare that we've now discussed in detail, threats for India. Give us a little bit of your thoughts on that.
Well, I should caveat this by saying I haven't looked as closely at India's military system as in the last 5 years as I did previously, but I did write a piece on it about a year ago on an update on India's armed forces. I tried to speak to a lot of people, including serving generals, retired generals, many officers involved in this, academics. And let me tell you a few things that surprised me, right? India's armed forces had not changed as dramatically over that sort of 5-6 year period as I had expected. I'm familiar with the long, agonizing debates in India over defense reform. And I know that a lot of huge changes took place when Bipin Rawat was made Chief of Defense Staff, and we had, the introduction of theater commands and more joint institutions. But on the technology front, I see some signs of innovation at the kind of army command level where interesting things are happening. So, for instance, I spoke and I quoted General Raj Shukla, who was, I think, commander of one of the army commands, but also then commander of the training and doctrine command of the Indian Armed Forces. And, what he was saying was that actually the defense ministry had been quite good at giving autonomy to the commands to say, we're not going to make you buy everything centrally and say, you must buy this drone. We will give you a budget, a small budget, not a big one, to say, see what works for you. See what works for you in Ladakh versus what works for you somewhere else. Because the UAV you might need at that altitude for that carrying capacity may be quite different. So that level of experimentation I was beginning to see at the command level, at the theater command, where you integrate it into operations. So, you might send a drone out on reconnaissance patrols in Ladakh to see what the Chinese patrols are doing. And then you see, how did it do? Was the quality of images enough? What was the range like? How did it cope with fog? How did it cope with inclement weather? How did the cold weather affect its battery? You might learn all these things and then you buy the next generation. But the critical thing is, some bureaucrat in Delhi is not doing that, right? That's the path to ruin. When you have a bureaucrat sitting there saying, here's the things the drone needs to do. No, you need the colonel on the ground saying, here's what I need this to do, and quickly feeding back to the company saying, I like this UAV. Actually, could you tweak the sensor on this and give me a thermal camera as well? Because I'm finding that I really need that to see what I need to see. You need that iterative loop. So when I wrote this piece a year ago, and a lot changes in a year, as you said.
It does.
I saw positive signs of that.
Yeah.
I also saw the beginnings of a pretty vibrant defense technology ecosystem at the private sector level that wasn't there in the same way when I was studying and writing about these things 10 years ago. Companies building really cutting edge things, whether that's kind of chips that go on satellites, whether that's UAVs with autonomy in them. Now, are these companies going to challenge globally? Are these companies, can they go toe to toe with the best American and Ukrainian and European firms? I don't know the answer to that yet, and I'm not going to prejudice that either way. I want to learn more. It's been a while since went to these places myself and spoke to the founders and looked at the tech and spoke to army officers face to face. And in this business, in my business, you have to do that. You have to talk to people face to face and get a sense of what's. And I would love to do that. So if anyone here is in India listening to this and builds defense technology and is building it and has worked with the Indian Army, I want to hear. I'd love to hear from you and hear your stories. What struck me is in Europe and America, I hear a lot of grumbles. It's difficult to work with the Pentagon. It's difficult to work with defense ministries. I was pleasantly surprised by the stories I heard from some companies in India saying, actually, the old stereotype of a kind of ossified bureaucracy is a bit less true than it was, and we find it actually they're pretty receptive to us. And I think that's great news. That's very encouraging to hear, and I would love to hear more about that and learn more about that.
Yeah, it seems that again, it's not something that I've got in-depth expertise in either. But my sense is that one, there's a whole range of now startups, and now I'm wearing my venture capital hat, and I'm saying this. I'm seeing a lot more interesting, innovative startups, frugal, innovation-driven startups emerge in the space ecosystem in India, right?
Yes, yes,
Which there have
absolutely.
been traditional strengths, ISRO, etc. Lots of successful missions that they've launched, and there's a good sort of level of collaboration. It seems that's happening, and incubation also happening between I think the space agencies of India and startups in that space. There have been some good successes, Pixel and a few other companies, names come to mind. I think similarly, much like I think the DIU in the US, um, there's been this IDEX program in India,
Yep.
which has at least incubated some of the startups. And I think you might be right that it might be early days to, judge whether they'll end up being global competitors to some of the players we've been discussing in a few years or not. But yeah, it's maybe a bit too early to say. But yes, there are signs of that kind of innovation to overcome the ossification that otherwise one would come to expect.
But in a world where, if I'm correct in saying that software-defined hardware
Yeah.
will be increasingly fundamental to defense, that is obviously a great advantage to a country like India with its breadth of software talent. But what I've seen over the years is having the best software is not enough, right? I've just finished writing a piece on defense and disruption innovation in DoD, and someone very closely involved with this said a line to me that I've quoted in my draft, which is a line that says, "We all know the problem. America has the best software in the world, and our military cannot use it." And that is a warning to all countries because it's not about having the best technology. It's about whether your bureaucracy and your state and your armed forces and your bureaucracy is capable of engaging with it, identifying it, absorbing it, and realizing that the way you build modern defense systems with software in them is not the way you built a fighter jet or a ship or a submarine.
Correct, and it requires completely different DNA, right? I mean, I think many big tech firms, I think you can talk to about how that process of creative destruction works, and it's the DNA shift. It's not the same companies. It's not the Microsoft guys who are building the best LLMs, right? So it's a complete shift that might be required in your defense production mindset to I think adapt to that software led defense production going forward.
Yes,
This has been great. Thank you so much, Shashank, for sharing your
not at all.
insights, your stories. I think this has been very helpful. If you have a couple more minutes, I want to ask
Sure.
you to try and bring all of this together and tell me that if there was another hot conflict, and God forbid, between the two geopolitical rivals of our world, the US and China, we've spoken about the cyber piece, the tech infra piece. We've spoken about the software driven work, AI driven software, satellites, recognition. We've talked about a lot of the pieces. Bring it all together to tell me, in your view, what does that hot war between a US and China tomorrow possibly look like?
Well, the fundamental thing about a hot war tomorrow is that it would be fought with the hardware built in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. And of course, it would be overlaid with the software and institutions of the 21st century. And so that's exactly what we see in Ukraine. And it's what we would see in the Pacific. You would have Arleigh Burke class destroyers in the Pacific, which I've been inside them. They look like, out of like a steampunk novel, kind of these in very industrial, old fashioned boats. But you would have an industrial scale effort to use software and sensors and AI to track, identify, and strike as many targets as you possibly could at a scale that would be unimaginable and impossible in the pre-AI age. That's really what it would come down to. It would come down to the responsiveness and speed of kill chains on both sides. So, how would these kill chains fare? Right? Would jamming and anti counter space warfare prevent America from using its strengths in this area? Would China be able to pull out capabilities we haven't seen in its ability to identify American targets? So that's one element. But the other element is people sometimes imagine that technology is a substitute for industrial strength and mass. And that's just not the case, right? We very clearly see in Ukraine and in other conflicts that technology, if both sides have it, can result in something that looks very messy and looks like the Iran Iraq conflict, a bloody attritional stalemate. So your AI may be able to spot 1,000 Chinese targets. Do you have 1,000 precision guided munitions that can then prosecute those targets? And if you do, in round two, do you still have any munitions left or have you run out? And then is it a contest of defense industries and replenishment and reconstitution? So, in other words, what I'm saying to you is that technology will play a fundamental role. AI will play a fundamental role. Who can detect targets the quickest, who can see things the quickest. But at the end of the day, the ability to stay in the fight, which requires reserves of physical things, is still vital. And the side that has expended all of its munitions and can then build the next round of them will still have a big, big advantage. And that ultimately still comes down to minerals, supply chains, steel, workers, factory production lines, a lot of the incredibly old fashioned stuff that we haven't invested in the West, and that many countries have allowed to atrophy dangerously.
Yeah, and of course, strategy. Um, at the end of the day, if you talk to army
Absolutely.
generals, and about this, when I do, it seems that, one piece that a lot of us who cover tech and the intersection of tech with war forget that ultimately, if you go back even into military history, that often it's that strategy element that can
Yeah.
overcome sometimes some of the tech
Yes.
strengths, advantages, or disadvantages that you have. Now, this has been great, Shashank. We end every podcast with two very quick questions, which is one, recommendations for a book or a set of books that for people interested in the kinds of topics we've discussed today, that you would recommend people read. And these have to be books other than your own or mine. And second would be recommendations for guests for the podcast for the future.
Well, one of the maybe I can double up on this answer actually, because you've talked about Paul Shah. I think you had Paul Shah on your podcast, and his book Army of None is one of my favorites. But you've already had him as a guest, and so the person I would then recommend is also a Stanford professor, Amy Ziegart. And she's written an interesting book called Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, which is about a lot of the issues we discussed in the first half of our conversation. It's about, the intelligence agencies, the importance of data, software, AI, open source intelligence, all of those other things. So I would strongly recommend that. I would also recommend, on the subject of cables, signals intelligence, technology, space, a Georgetown professor called Aaron Bateman, who is, I think, has written a book on the Reagan Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars Initiative. But he's also working on books on I think cable security, the history of cables. So Aaron Bateman is the other person I would recommend as someone who I enjoy reading and learning from on these issues.
Yeah. What about people from China? Are there people who've covered maybe the same set of issues that we've been discussing, obviously from the Europe and American and lens? Do you follow or do you know of good people who've studied how the Chinese thinking on this evolving, the intersection of military and AI there, the intersection of tech and intelligence there?
Um, it's a terrific question, and I don't know people in China. To my perhaps to my shame, I do follow some very good people at Georgetown has a Center for Security and Emerging a Security and a Center for Security and Emerging Technology, CSET.
Yeah, yeah,
Sam Bresnick.
yeah, yeah.
And I've read Sam's work on how the PLA thinks about AI and software in its own defense strategies. Is it ahead of the US? Is it behind? How does it think about ethical considerations? He's done some very, very interesting work on this on these issues as well. There's also someone who's written some very good papers for the International Committee of the Red Cross on autonomous weapon systems, and Arthur Holland Michel. He did some great papers for the ICRC on the role of AI and decision support systems in war, and the role that AI plays in helping command and control, and the ethical challenges that arise from that.
No, great. These are a great set of recommendations. Thanks so much. This has been great conversations, Sean. Thanks for sharing. Look forward to reading your upcoming pieces as well. And I hope that we can continue this conversation.
Thank you very much for having me, and I very much look forward to picking this up again in the future.
Great.